Welcome everybody to the 9/11 Tribute Museum's virtual My 9/11 story. Today you'll be hearing a personal 9/11 story from Andy Von Salis, who is a volunteer at the 9/11 Tribute Museum. As this will be on YouTube, if you have any questions for Andy, please feel free to add them to the comment section and I'll be happy to ask Andy those questions for you. So without any further ado, I'll give the floor up to Andy to share his personal story. Andy?
Well, thank you, Vicky. This is Andy, and I usually go by just the nickname Andy, although I do work as a lawyer, and I was working as a lawyer on September 11th of 2001, which I assumed was going to be an ordinary day, although the weather was absolutely stunningly gorgeous. So I thought, okay, so it may be a memorable day, but it turned out to be memorable in other ways than that. I had always known about the World Trade Center. I was a kid, but I lived 30 miles out of town in the hills in northwestern New Jersey when the Empire State Building was the only thing that you could possibly see above the horizon if you look towards New York on a clear day. And then suddenly, when I was an adolescent, they started building a couple of towers right near it, and that was the World Trade Center. I always was fascinated by the World Trade Center. There was a whole special edition of the National Geographic or something about that. And so I always wanted to visit the World Trade Center, wanted to be in New York, etc. One thing I never did get to do was to stand on top of the Twin Towers where there was a public observation deck on the South Tower roof. But I did get a chance to visit the upper floors of the World Trade Twin Towers on a few occasions for either to visit a restaurant up there or just to go to somebody's office once or twice. So the World Trade Center had a part in everybody's lives if they lived in New York. And as an adult, I did move to New York and lived there and worked in New York and commuted daily in 2001. So the World Trade Center was familiar to me for that reason, but the World Trade Center was a multi-purpose thing. It was one of the first real big complexes ever built in Manhattan where there are no shopping malls or anything. And it was designed to be a base where companies involved with world trade, economic activity, could thrive off one another and feed each other's needs. So there was everything there, from restaurants and bookstores to travel agencies and other kind of service companies of various kinds. And Lower Manhattan, which is the area where the World Trade Center and the Stock Exchange have always been, was renewed by the construction of the World Trade Center. Midtown, where the Empire State Building is and the main railroad terminal, are 3 or 4 miles farther north and had kind of eclipsed Lower Manhattan, but Lower Manhattan began a comeback, and it is still one of the two main hubs of life in New York City. So what happened on September 11 was that I was a husband and father and going to work as usual, but the day was so gorgeous with a clear sky that it was so crystal clear that it seemed like if you hit the sky with a hammer, it would shatter. One of those rare, crisp, clear blue days where everything looked like it was made of glass. You couldn't even tell how high the sky was. So people were stopping on the way to the subway or on the way in and out of their office buildings just to stare at the ceiling, at the sky. It was so gorgeous. That color of blue, it made an impression on everyone in New York, and the Tribute Museum, and as well as the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum, which is also in Lower Manhattan, have used that color of blue as a sort of a theme color of their design scheme ever since, and that's very intentional. So the day made an impression on people right away, but other than that, it was a fairly ordinary day. There were a couple of things that were happening that were for special people. It was the first day of the school year for the public school system. My children were not in the public school system, so we were among the 500,000 others who dropped our kids off elsewhere in the morning. My kids were already used to the school year, and we had met the new boy and his parents in the third grade. So I got to know Frank and Nicole a little bit right from the first day of school. On September 11th, that was the fourth day of my daughter's school. So I took them into school, dropped them off in downtown Brooklyn on my way into Manhattan, jumped back on the subway as usual, and went into Lower Manhattan. The kids said, "Go ahead, go to work, Dad. We already know these friends. Our new friends are fine. You don't have to just hover." So we realized they were all grown up now in third and seventh grades, and I went to work. When I got there, I got out of the subway amidst some tumult. There were a couple of people who were frantically trying to run onto the subway in this financial hub area of Manhattan, where few people lived at the time. Some people live there now, but not very many. But at that time, it was odd to watch somebody frantically run onto the train, and one woman was yelling, "It's terrible! It's terrible! A plane hit the towers! A plane hit the towers! We got to get out of here!" And the rest of us just sort of stared at her, trying to figure out what was wrong with her. Well, it turns out that what was wrong with her is that New York City had been attacked by jet airliners, wide-bodied airplanes crashing into Lower Manhattan. There was such a thing as airplane hijacking ever since the 1960s. People might steal an airplane to fly to Cuba and defect to communism or something like that. But usually nobody was injured. The plane would land and the person would be either arrested or welcomed into Cuba or whatever, and the plane would return to its route and finish delivering its passengers. And, it was be a disruption for the day. It was a crime, of course, to hijack an airplane, but it was very different than stealing an airliner with two aisles and hundreds of passengers on board and flying it directly into a crowded skyscraper. On September 11, the airplanes that hit the World Trade Center in New York, and there were two of them, one for each of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. They had left Boston at 8 in the morning, and so they got to New York City before 9, and not everybody was at work yet. It was also the first day of school, so some people were dropping their kids off at their kids' school instead of being at the office at 9. And it was also the day after Monday Night Football, when everybody has to stay up late and watch TV, especially if New York is in the Monday Night Football game playing against a team in Denver, which is 2 time zones farther west, and everybody was up late the night before. And then it was also the day of the primary election to see who would be the next mayor of New York. And one of the candidates in the Republican primary was Michael Bloomberg, who won the election. However, the election was not actually completed that day. In fact, a lot of people never even completed their morning commute to get into work that day. Other people had gotten into work early, and in the World Trade Center, where you had people involved with international trade, there were many people who were there, if not overnight, at least at the crack of dawn, so they could get on the phone to Europe and do business. So there were different categories of people, and it was just a matter of chance as to whether you were at work that day or not. About 50,000 people worked in the World Trade Center, and there were probably about 20 or 25,000 of them who had already gotten to work or almost gotten to work by 9 in the morning. One of the airplanes flew directly into the north wall of the North Tower, which is a tall square building of 110 stories, and the airplane hit above the 90th floor and destroyed the upper 90s into the low 100s. The airplane went right through the center of the tower, where the central core has all of the elevators and all of the communications and all of the electricity and utilities and all of the stairwells. The core of each of the twin towers was designed to hold up 60% of the weight of the entire tower, and the rest of it was held up by the outer walls of the World Trade Center. That's why the World Trade Center's twin towers look so stripy and vertical, is because when you see a picture there, you're looking at the columns, steel-clad columns on the exterior of the building. But they're only 22 inches apart in order to support all of that weight. And so there's tall, vertical, narrow windows. So it was a strange building in a lot of ways. One of them is that if you had that many people in the building, it only worked if you could bring them to their floor on elevators that were using the same elevator shaft as another cab higher up in a different segment of the building. So there were express elevators to get you to your segment and then local elevators to get you to your floor. So it was an engineering marvel in a lot of ways, and it was remarkable that it stood. In fact, it was presumably designed to withstand the impact of a 1960s vintage airplane, but by the 1970s, they were developing jumbo jets, and the 767s that hit the World Trade Center were two-aisle wide-bodied planes that held hundreds of passengers if they were full. It was a 6 a.m. flight, so they weren't all that full, but there were still a lot of people on those airplanes. All in all, everyone who was on the airplanes that hit the World Trade Center was killed, mostly on impact. And in the towers themselves, an awful lot of people were killed as well because the stairwells were severed, the communications were out, and the building was on fire with smoke and fumes. So the World Trade Center was an unforeseen and unaccustomed disaster, even though New York City is well aware of high-rise fires and what to do about them. The New York Fire Department had over 15,000 people, and they came from all of their different fire houses, which are called companies, all over New York City. There were hundreds of separate units, and dozens of them responded to Lower Manhattan. By the time they got there wasn't really that much of a way to fight the fire because the fire was 100 stories above ground in each of the twin towers. But the firefighters did know about evacuations and about traffic control and about medical rescue, etc. Many of the firefighters did run up the stairs of the World Trade Center as best they could. Some of their packs of equipment were 80 or 85 pounds. And by the time you've climbed 100 stories, that's an awful lot of weight. But there were firefighters who are known to have reached the upper portions of the building in each of the towers. And the idea was to get everyone out. A lot of people felt that they should do what you usually do in a high-rise fire, which is wait to be rescued and follow instructions rather than crowd the stairwells that just causes more confusion. But on September 11, people had had the experience of having fire in the towers previously. There was a bomb that went off, a terrorist bomb went off in 1993, 8 years before the World Trade attacks. And so people had learned that evacuating in slowly and in chaos was something to be avoided. And there were effective fire drills and other improvements to the stairs and to the buildings. So that in the World Trade Towers, after they were hit by jetliners with no electricity and a lot of smoke and fumes and everything in the towers themselves, still about 80 or 85% of the people who were in the towers did manage to get out alive by going down the stairs. We know that there were thousands of people killed, and in fact 2,753 people were killed in the World Trade Center crash in Manhattan. And on September 11, there were 2 other hijacked planes that hit Washington, D.C. and that crashed elsewhere in Pennsylvania. But, so the total who were killed that day was almost 2,800 people. But I'm sorry, 29, it was in the 2900s. So there were a couple of hundred people who were killed elsewhere than in New York City. And it turned out to be the largest mass homicide in the city's history and gave a terrible blip to our statistics. It's a very aberrational year in every way. So those of us who were there were trying to figure out what to do about it. I got my myself out of the immediate neighborhood where I was getting off the subway and trying to navigate the streets to work at the time that the planes hit and everyone began to marshal the people to leave Lower Manhattan. So I joined the crowd. I was in a throng of people, shoulder to shoulder, filling the outbound traffic lanes, 3 traffic lanes on the Brooklyn Bridge to get to Brooklyn. Others were shooed out of Lower Manhattan to whichever direction was closest to where they were at the time. My office was a little on the east side of the Lower Manhattan, so the Brooklyn Bridge was convenient for me. I lived in Brooklyn, and so I crossed the bridge. It was a very somber crowd tromping out of Lower Manhattan over the bridge. People weren't saying much. People didn't know much. People couldn't see anything because the World Trade Towers only stood for about an hour and a half before each of them separately crashed. That's because the metal of the structural steel in the central core of each tower was not able to withstand being melted by the incredible heat of a jumbo jet full of enough jet fuel to go to California nonstop, all catching fire at once in that constricted space where each tower acted like a chimney. So I did not know what had actually happened to the towers because there was so much smoke and ash that you couldn't see. Instead, I had walked up towards the courthouse where I was supposed to appear at 9:30. I got there early and I waited for the courthouse to open. There were sirens and everything all over Lower Manhattan, but I thought that must be some big fire, and it was. But I had no idea that there would be anything on that cataclysmic a scale. The people stopped arriving at the courthouse eventually, and by 9:30, the staff there decided to evacuate it. So I joined the crowd that was leaving Lower Manhattan, and we weren't saying much as we trooped across the bridge. You certainly couldn't see much. If you looked back towards Lower Manhattan, you just saw this huge fog bank of gray ash, and the air was becoming thicker and thicker with it as the cloud of dust and ash ended up subsuming Lower Manhattan to a height about 2 or 3 times as high as the roofs of the tallest skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan. Aside from the World Trade Center, some of them were over 70 or 80 stories. So we just marched out across the bridge, not knowing what was causing this big cloud of dust and ash, but hearing rumors. There were cell phones, but they weren't working. The towers were out of commission. And there were radios, but the broadcast antenna turned out to have been gone because radio stations broadcast from the roof of the World Trade Center, where the North Tower had an antenna on top of it. If you look at the Twin Towers in a photograph, you can see that the television and the radio antenna was vulnerable to the loss of the tower. So we just trudged across the Brooklyn Bridge. New Yorkers just cope with whatever life throws at us because it's usually unpredictable. And when I got to the Brooklyn side, I thought, well, I'll go to my daughter's school and see if they're closing or if they're open or what's going on, and tell them I'm okay, whatever. And so I went to their school and they didn't let me in. They said, that you're too scary. You can't really come in. And I went, what? And they picked up my eyeglasses that I was wearing off my face. And everything that had been so dusty and dark and cloudy was actually no longer so dusty, dark, and cloudy inside the lobby of the school, where I had just had so much grit and ash on my eyeglasses that I thought that it was dark and cloudy, when actually inside it was perfectly fine. They had lights and electricity and everything was normal. The kids were fine, and they were holding on to the kids for the rest of the day if parents were going to have trouble getting there. And a lot of them did. I realized later that the subways were all out of commission for most of the day because the electric power grid in Lower Manhattan was knocked out. So there was a lot going on that I didn't realize until later. So I walked home, which was in a couple of miles, changed my clothes so I didn't look so scary. I had looked in the mirror and I absolutely looked like a gray snowman, not just my glasses, but my hair, everything was just solid, light gray. The ash was terrible in the way it smelled. It stank of burning concrete and burning chemicals and burning paper, because everything that was in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center had been incinerated. Um, I gradually began to realize what was going on. Of course, the national media and the local media had found out what was going on. And while the radio and television stations weren't broadcasting normally, some people had cable TV, and by the year 2001, my house didn't. But, so people were telling us who had been in Lower Manhattan what had happened to Lower Manhattan, because we were the ones who didn't know. About 500,000 people did evacuate by walking out of Lower Manhattan that morning. And many others evacuated other parts of the city just because they didn't want to be anywhere near Manhattan. I changed my clothes, went back to the school, went up to the 6th floor, got my daughter, and we got home. By then, some local buses were running, and we began to try to resume a normal day and a normal life. But some things were not normal. The new boy in my 3rd grader's class had her parents were both in the World Trade Center when it got attacked. And Nicole was sent down the stairs by Frank. He was an architect who knew about buildings, and said, get these people off of this floor and get them out of the building. It might become unstable. And he was right. So she said, well, what about you, Frank? And he said, I'll be following up, but he was helping to try to get some elevator doors open, which wouldn't open because there was no electricity, and get some more people out of the upper floors of their tower of the World Trade. So Nicole got out, and Frank did not. At the World Trade Center site now is a memorial with 2 deep pools of waterfalls, and around the edge of each one are the names of those who were killed at the World Trade Center that day, and those who were killed elsewhere by the 9/11 attacks. As I said, it's 2,900 people. And so the memory of Frank is literally etched into the face of that memorial, along with all the other names. It's a large memorial because each World Trade Tower was 1 acre. And so each of them reflecting, or not reflecting, but the waterfall pools standing where the 2 towers stood are right there on the footprints of the towers, and they are huge. If you visit the Lower Manhattan and visit that memorial, you'll see the scale of just the footprints of those towers. And the memorial is a graphic illustration of how vast New York City's loss was on that day, because the pools are the size of the towers, and they are so deep that you can't see the bottom from the rim of the pool. That's intentional. The landscape architect made the memorial be an illustration of the absence of all of the people who are present with their names right there in your face, right at the edge of this abyss. So it's a very dramatic memorial. Underneath it, they have developed a huge museum. The National 9/11 Museum is got enough exhibits to keep anybody busy for a week, looking at everything involving the history of 9/11, but also involving the lives and existence of the communities and the people who were lost on that day in New York and in the other places in the United States that were attacked on that day. As I said, there were 4 planes. And the Memorial Plaza is planted with symbolic things of all nature, but there is hardly any explanatory signage. You can have a guide leaflet, but it's a very quiet, respectful place that could serve as a cemetery or memorial as well as a museum. So I encourage people to visit New York City, visit the Lower Manhattan site, get a sense of how of the scale of what had happened on that day and some of the drama that had happened on that day. The museum tells a lot of stories of it. The World Trade Center is being gradually rebuilt, one building at a time. There was a pretty bad economic recession since 2000 that lasted for years, but eventually things are being rebuilt and there's demand for office space again. And New York has renewed itself in a new and different way, the way New York has done many different times over the course of its history. And New York loves to see people who want to visit, want to understand, want to experience the excitement and the difference and the variety and the unpredictability of New York City. And if you come, we'll be glad to welcome you. The 9/11 Tribute Museum has exhibits that are open almost every day of the year, and we tell our personal stories there, as well as on the plaza with guided walking tours. So that we do welcome people who want to understand our experience, which is one of renewal, ultimately. We remember, we recover, and we renew, and we try to build a world that's better than the one that we lost in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, and preferably, hopefully, guide the world with our example of unity of the world's people and cultures, and trade and commerce among the four parts of the world, and welcoming the diversity of the people of the world to New York, a diverse city. Thank you for listening to me. I may have gone on longer than you expected, but hopefully you weren't bored. There is a lot to say about every personal story in New York City, and we've got millions of them. But those of us at the Tribute Museum have our special angle that we want to tell you about, and we can show you some more if you come and visit New York. Thank you for caring, and thank you for your own contribution to renewal and understanding among the people of the United States and of the world. And look me up if you see me at the 9/11 Tribute Museum.
All right. Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you for sharing your story. It's always an honor, and also thank you for sharing Frank's story too, because him not being here to be able to share his story. It's important that people who know about his story are able to share that with people, and create more understanding as to what happened that day and the unsung heroes of that day. So thank you so much for sharing his story as well. So that is going to conclude today's program. As noted at the beginning of the program, if you have any questions for Andy, please feel free to add them to the comment section, and I'll be happy to ask them to Andy for you. With that, that is a wrap. Thank you once again, Andy, and we'll see you next time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.